this is a very rich topic. I'll give the simple answer up front, and then we could go into some of the deeper elements to this. But the way I tend to look at it is, if you think about complexification as development, something is growing and maturing, let's say, um, there comes a point at which the ability to understand your own um, process of development has been embedded in particular structures. So, for example, right, like you're born, you're taught things, you just learn, you grow, and whatever. But then at a certain point, you start to come online. You're reflective about this whole process. You're like, hey, my teachers taught me certain things. Why did they teach me those things and not others? You start to become aware of like things like systems and power structures and these sorts of like structures that exist in the world that were crucial for the conditioning of your experience of reality. Now, on the one hand, what you're doing is deconstructing something, right? And that's what we call that, like in postmodern deconstructionist thought. You're taking apart these systems and you're sort of revealing them for what they are. You've become aware of them and you're reflective of them, and so you're able to do that. So there's a deconstructive thing that's going on there, but at the same time, you need to have developed to a certain point to be able to do that process. So it takes going through the system to be able to then use what you've learned by that process to sort of gain an understanding of the system and then deconstruct it. And I think something like that is going on with, let's say, the ego, right? You've got your sense of the ego that starts to come online, in the early phases. And at first you're kind of just, you're kind of egocentric and you do what you want and you whatever. And then you start to become aware of other people, and then you have to kind of take that into account. And then you're getting a more sense of like, well, what do I really like? What do I want? What are the things? And then you start to build this sort of persona and all that, right? And then eventually, this doesn't happen for many people, maybe most people, but eventually you can become aware of the ego formation process. And you're like, oh, this is what the ego formation process is about. It's about determining who am I, and what is, and then you start to be able to question, well, what is this I? Who is this me, right? But that's a developmental process. A 5-year-old can't do that. A 10-year-old can't do that. A teenager is very unlikely to be able to do that. So there's something that is growing and developing and complexifying to begin to be able to do that. And so you can think of complexification itself as leading towards the capacity to do what you were just talking about. And at a certain point, this kind of becomes a semantic, metaphorical distinction, right? Because, we're using metaphors that then begin to clash with each other. Because on the one hand, it's like you build up until you build down. Well, wait, that doesn't really make sense, right? So some of this is just some semantic confusion in the different images that we're using to describe certain kind of spiritual processes and things. So like Susan Cook-Greuter's model of ego development speaks to this very explicitly, that, this is sort of the arc that you go through, and you get to the kind of post-conventional stages, and then you're able to deconstruct the ego, that sort of a thing. I find this a really interesting topic and really important too. And I think that there needs to be more time spent clarifying exactly what this process is and how we best conceive it. But so that would be the short answer to this idea, right? Is that no, it really still is a complexification developmental process, but it's one in which you are kind of further able to disembed yourself from the assumptions and the conditioning and all that sort of thing. But the other thing I'll say briefly is that there is some legitimate confusion, or let's say at the very least different takes on this idea. And some spiritual processes or activities or practices really are about regressing. And it's an open question, the value of that. And more than that, some spiritual processes can be conceived of as either regressing or progressing, and whether or not they are inherently one or the other, and why and what that is really going on there. I think this is a really crucial issue, and I'll frame this in this way to explain why I think this is so important. So I talked earlier about nihilism, right? And how both fundamentalism and kind of modernist reductionism and nihilism are forms of nihilism, because they're all saying no to the world. They want to get you out of the world, or they want to just give up on the idea of meaning, right? But like, there's a sense in which all this is bad, and it's all doesn't really matter anyway. Let's say it doesn't matter. So that's nihilism, and that's nasty religion and nasty meaninglessness. Now, there is a very compelling case to be made that not just Christian fundamentalism is nihilism, but many other forms of religion as well, including what we tend to think of as some forms of mysticism. When Buddhism was initially introduced to the West, it was understood as Eastern nihilism, because it was the belief that life is bad, we've got to get out of it, and the way you do that is basically by embracing the void and nothingness, and emptiness. And I think that it's more complicated than that, but I do think that there's an element in which that's true for some people and in some traditions, and this becomes very complicated because different traditions can relate to the ideas of the traditions at different levels of understanding and complexity and everything. But the degree to which what we really should be trying to do with our existence is basically obliterate consciousness entirely, does seem to correlate with some forms of spiritual practice, which I would see as being nihilistic. So this is a very interesting question, and it's an unresolved tension in my own thinking, right? Because it goes to the core of what spirituality is all about. What is the spiritual life about? Is it about becoming more open-minded and understanding, regressing back to a pre-conscious level and actually obliterating the sense of phenomenal existence entirely, and by hurling yourself into the void, as it were, and getting out? Different articulations of this journey exist, and so there are different ways of understanding it and everything. But the question of nihilism is really crucial, and is really what all my work is about. And I want desperately to be able to articulate a spirituality that is not nihilistic. And that's why I find the complexification narrative so attractive, apart from even just the fact that it seems to be just the way things are. But, psychologically, it's fulfilling to me, because for so much of my life, the religion and the spirituality that I've been presented with has been nihilistic in nature. It's been, the apocalypse is going to come and we'll get out of here, and then blah, blah, blah. Or even, okay, well, what about meditation? What about enlightenment? Oh, no, we're just doing that because consciousness is the experience of suffering and we want to obliterate consciousness. Oh, well, I don't like that either. And then, then you read Nietzsche, and he's like really critical of all this stuff, but then he wants to like create overmen and be like Cesar Borgia. So it's like, well, that's not good either. So I'm part of what compels me to even think about a project of like trying to articulate a religious framework is I feel like we need to grapple with this problem. So anyway, that's a long answer.
Yeah. Nah, it's a great answer. I guess what's coming up for me is because I am thinking about Buddhism and how the teachings are often perceived as nihilism, and like emptiness is perceived as nihilism, but that's not what emptiness really means. And it seems like in, the highest states of meditation, which many people report as being like cessation, which is like complete nothingness, right? But it seems like there's something in that. And even for myself, like having ego dissolving experiences, like with 5-MeO, spoke a lot about that. But and you mentioned that in your book also. But like there's something in that, like seeing the ego dissolve completely and then coming back and the ego coming back online. Now your relationship with that is completely different. So there's something in the void, there's something in the emptiness, there's something in the nothingness that is actually, it's not the way we understand. It's not the way we conceptualize nothingness and emptiness, because it actually brings awe. And one of the things that there was a quote that it's like, true emptiness is wondrous being. Like I was just reading this. So it's like, it's like you become completely open and curious. It's not like you retract and move away from life, which is like that could be a pathological way. It's like, all I'm going to do is meditate and sit in cessation somewhere and not engage in life.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I would agree, like I would be all on board with an articulation in which, for example, right? I like the way you put that when you experience the void and then you jump and you get back into this ego state, then you can compare them. Then you have a better sense of what the ego is, right? That to me is growth. That is development because people like Robert Keegan and other developmental thinkers really understand development as being, well, Piaget. I mean, the whole tradition of human development is one in which the subject is continually being disembedded in that which they were blind to before, and being able to take their self as the subject, or sorry, as the object. And like, what more radical way could you do that but by the total dissolution of the ego and the experience of the non-ego, and then being able to come back into the ego and compare those two experiences. Like, then you see that whatever it is that you are has to contain somehow both of those things. So you've included both of them. You have complexified because now you are formlessness and you are form at the same time. So like, various forms of Vajrayana Buddhism and these sorts of more esoteric ideas of formlessness and form being one, I can grok much more, because I feel like that really does fit in much nicer with a sense of this is the complexification process. And that when we do that, when we're able to make that separation and then compare, we're able to get a much better sense of what the self is. And it is this all-encompassing total reality. And then you have one narrative of continued growth, of continued complexification and self-knowledge and increasing kind of objectification of the ego on a process that ultimately leads to the dissolution of the ego entirely, that then is able to recognize that there's something outside of that ego concept, and whatever that is needs to then be taken into the sense of what the self is. And anyway, so this is where it all leads to this sort of mystical omega thing.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying maps well. And even if you look at Buddhism, there's a complexification, like you said, Vajrayana, Tantra. It's like it's
Mm,
coming back and embracing all the form. It's coming back and
mm.
like actually, embracing everything, embracing sex, embracing alcohol, embracing because it's all part of the same thing. It's all part of reality. So I think it maps well with that too.